I just want to first thank Josh and Carla and Brittany and Michelle for that intro and all of the organizers. This has taken a tremendous amount of work, but it's been really thrilling to watch it unfold and see all of this enthusiasm and energy be directed towards middle schoolers, who are some of my favorite people on the planet and too often are neglected. So as Michelle mentioned, I am a counselor, I'm also a therapist, and I'm a journalist, and so I have several different hats that I bring to the phase, and that has impacted my perspective. And about 4 or 5 years ago, I started realizing there wasn't much material out there. I was looking for research, for information that would help me innovate in the school setting, that would help me advise parents, that would help me advise teachers. And what I was finding is that tweens and middle schoolers were getting lumped in with 17-year-olds. And as any of us who work with middle schoolers know, there is a vast divide between a 6th and an 8th grader, let alone between an 8th grader and a 17-year-old. And I, as a counselor, was looking for more ways that I could innovate in the school setting. So I had to do my own writing in order to make that happen and start looking at what was available out there. And I wanted to create a common language for parents, for school officials. There was a lot of misunderstanding. So parents were frustrated at times. They didn't understand as a parent why their child might be shutting down or why their child might seem more belligerent or more angry or more disorganized. And they also didn't really understand the decisions the school was making all of the time, things that they might consider bullying, the school might not consider bullying. They might want the school to be helping more with executive functioning. And then on the school side, there was a corollary where teachers were expressing frustration with parents who are either over-involved or not involved enough, either bringing their kids lunch or just taking a giant step back. And there was a subset of teachers who were really personalizing some of the behavior that I saw as being very typical and normal for young adolescents. So it makes sense that parents are taking a step back from a psychological perspective. I'm just, in this room alone, is there anyone who would say that middle school is the best time of their life? The highlight? A few people? So I think we all bring that to the table. Even if we had a relatively positive experience, we ourselves were in the throes of puberty when we were in middle school. We were experiencing everything as a 10 in terms of our emotions, and so we don't necessarily want to relive it with our kids, even if those experiences weren't inherently worse than experiences we had at other points in our life. Plus, we have the kids themselves who are saying, you know what, I'm going to take, I would like some more independence, I would like some autonomy, I don't really want you involved in the school setting, so the parents are getting this message from their kids that they don't want them there. So there's a lot of insecurity about what a parent's role is in this phase. But the issue is that kids really do need parents, they need educators, they need coaches, they need mentors, they need every adult who's in their realm to be very involved, just in a very, very different way. So I wrote Middle School Matters in order to come up with a roadmap for how all of these different stakeholders could interact with the age group. Are we able to advance the? Thank you. Okay, so what's the big deal about middle school? I like to think of middle school as the last best chance. So it's not that it's the last chance entirely, but it's this really, really significant developmental phase where kids are intellectually sophisticated, but they're still malleable. They care what we think, and even if they don't always show it, and we have a chance to really help them solidify their values and to develop the skills they're going to need to be successful in middle school and beyond. And the stakes are low, but the stakes are also high. So it's a good time to experiment and to take risks, and that's how the stakes are low. But they're high in that if we don't get in there and if we don't coach them and teach them and mentor them during this phase, we are missing this prime opportunity. And there's a lot of research showing why this is a prime opportunity. For starters, there is the statistic that really stops me is that between 2007 and 2014, the suicide rate has doubled among 10 to 14-year-olds. And there are a lot of theories as to why that's happening, and I will talk a little bit more about how we can help them self-regulate emotions and help them navigate those highs and lows. The second thing that happens is that they have a drop in confidence and a drop in performance, a drop in academic self-identity. There's a famous, George Land's famous creativity test shows that over the lifespan and over childhood, kids lose creativity over time, but what's significant is that in the middle school years, it drops from 30% to 12%. So there's suddenly this steep decline, and I view middle school as an opportunity to really help kids maintain that innovative focus, maintain the willingness at this time when they're really insecure to still continue to create and innovate. We also know that when kids make that transition, and initially in the 1960s when we first started thinking about middle school as this distinct developmental phase, we started trying to figure out how to make it a little different than high school, because I went to a junior high, and junior high back then was 7th and 8th grade, and it was really a mini high school, and that didn't serve the needs of young adolescents at all. So we, in the 80s and 90s, started to put a lot more focus into what middle school could look like and should look like. And then there was this drop-off. We suddenly stopped focusing on middle school. Everybody was fixated on early childhood and literacy, or that college and career transition. And so middle school became the middle child, the lost, forgotten middle child. So if we want to preserve their confidence and preserve their creativity, we need to be taking a really hard look at all of our structures, our academic structures. We know that kids who are top dog in 6th grade do better. We know that kids who transition in 6th or 7th grade experience a drop in performance and a drop in confidence. And I don't want to make today about whether we should have a K through 5 structure or a K through 8 or a 5 through 8 or a 6 through 8. I think that the one thing that all of this has in common is that there's this distinct developmental phase, and kids in this age group have very, very specific needs. They're also establishing their identity. So their identity is being developed as their empathy is also developing, and also bullying is peaking. So all of this is coming together, and this manifests in a lot of different ways. And today with social media, we know that kids are having there's probably the biggest generational divide between tweens and their parents than in any other generation. There's something like 95% of them are spending half their time online. They are never really getting a break from that. They're getting exposed to darker news events. They're getting exposed to more divisive political times. There's more anxiety overall, and there's that level of emotional contagion. And then they're trying to establish their identity in the midst of this, and in this petri dish where their peers are not necessarily intending to be mean, but they're still developing those social skills and those empathy skills. We know that 25% of kids have been the victim of electronic dating aggression. So that is a new way that bullying can manifest in the middle school years. We know that 10% self-identify as being the perpetrator of electronic dating aggression. So we have what we see in front of us, and then we have this whole other part of their life that's going on when they leave school. I'm a huge proponent of creating safe spaces in middle school, GSAs, boys groups, anything you can think of, whatever a child thinks of as being a salient part of their identity. And one of the ways we get tripped up is we impose on them what we think is a salient part of their identity. Maybe they would like to be in a students of color, or maybe they wouldn't like to be in a students of color group. My favorite story about safe spaces is a kid who came to me one day and said, "I want to be in your adoption group." And I said, I'm really fascinated because you're not adopted. Can you tell me more? And he said, yeah, I belong in your adoption group because I have 2 dads and I'm the product of an egg donor, and just like the kids who are adopted, I don't know who my biological mother is. And I said, you know what? You're right. This is the right group for you. And he has fit right in and been talking to the other kids about these issues and having a lot of the same concerns. About 5 years ago, when I was in a large public middle school, I had a few students come to me who wanted to start a GSA. And I was told there was only one other middle school GSA in the county at the time. And I couldn't even find that one. It was so on the down low, and everybody was so careful about, protecting kids. It ended up sending a contradictory message that there was something shameful as opposed to private. So here we are touting the importance of diversity and then telling kids they had to fly under the radar. And I think it speaks volumes that I could not even figure out which school had this GSA. Now we have seen a huge growth in GSAs, which is incredible because kids who are in GSAs experience 20% fewer homophobic remarks, and they are 48% less likely to be bullied. So another thing that's happening among tweens, and I'm just trying to give an overall big picture here, is that they're changing faster than they've changed at any time in their life other than between 0 and 2. And when you think about what's happening to them, besides puberty, they're changing intellectually, they're changing physically. This is when they also, sort of cruel, suddenly become exactly aware and acutely aware of how they stack up to everyone else. So you might have a 6th grader, and I was talking to a parent yesterday who was saying that her middle schooler looks like a 3rd grader and is on the basketball team with a kid who's shaving. So you have this huge difference in kids in the same age group, and they have to somehow navigate this without losing their confidence and dealing with the insecurity that comes along with it anyway. And then, on top of all of those internal changes, and on top of that insecurity and that burgeoning awareness of how they stack up to others and their concern with whether or not they're good enough, they suddenly have to make this massive transition. So going back to the middle school model and the developmental needs of this age group, I'll take a sample kid, let's call her Tori. So maybe in 5th grade, Tori is walking to school with her friends, and her parents know all of her friends and all of her friends' parents, and she checks into school and she sees her homeroom teacher, who she's going to be spending the vast bulk of the day with, and that teacher knows her and she knows the teacher. She's with the same group of kids all day long, which is very reassuring. And she's getting recess every day, probably, and time for unstructured socializing, which is so important for resilience. And then what do? Very typically, at the exact moment when kids most want a connection with a caring adult, at the exact moment when they most need to feel a sense of belonging among their peers and familiarity, we take them out of that environment. Often we put them on a bus. We send them to a new, huge school, in many cases where they are navigating 7 different homeroom teachers and 7 different groups of 30 revolving sets of kids, and they don't necessarily think their teachers care about them. There's research out of the University of Wisconsin that Jeffrey Borman has done that shows that simply explaining to kids that and telling them social stories from kids 1 year older that they at first also thought that their teachers didn't care about them, but then they realized they did. Those kids have better outcomes all the way through. So and then we take away recess. Maybe there's PE once a week. There's nothing hugely different about this 10-year-old from when they were in 5th grade until when they went to 6th grade. If anything, they have more need for movement, more need for connection. So I think it's incredibly important that everyone out there who's a researcher, who's an educator, a practitioner, a psychologist is collecting the data to really figure out what are those structures that we have to put in place in order to support kids through this developmental stage. One of the things I've been trying to do for the last several years is combat some of the myths about tweens. We have such a negative cultural rhetoric, and if you think about the insecurity of kids in this age group, it's critical that we focus on their strengths and not their deficits. And when we as adults are reinforcing this idea that this is a phase where we should take a big step back, where this is a phase to dread, this is a time we just need to kind of grin and bear it and get through it, they're internalizing all of that. And kids who don't think that their peers mean well or that their peers care about them are less likely to be trusting, are less likely to have a positive experience. So I do a lot to try to encourage adults to message middle school in a more positive way, and I also really work hard with kids themselves to help them see that their peers also are well-meaning. They're just lacking in skills and their empathy is developing. A story that happened fairly recently that I shared with my students, and I'll share it here, is that a parent called me She was really upset because her daughter had a best friend, and this best friend was in the street in the neighborhood and heard two mutual friends saying really mean things about her best friend. So because she was her best friend and because she cared about her, she thought that the best course of action would be to secretly videotape these two girls calling her friend a loser and saying she was annoying and had no friends, and then to make sure she understood who she could trust, to send the videotape to her friend. We as adults know nothing good can come of that. All it does is spread the meanness. The parent was just flabbergasted. How could she think this was a good idea? How do I deal with this at this point? And I said, I really don't think this was intended to wound, and this is kind of what defines this age group. They're really learning. This is why they need our coaching. This is why they need us in there. So the next day, I was in a 6th grade classroom, and I said, out of curiosity, and I told them this story, how many of you think it was okay for her to secretly videotape her friends? They all raised their hands. And then I said, how many of you think it was the right, loyal thing to then send the tape to her so that she could know who she could trust? And again, they raised their hands. So I spent a good chunk of time after that asking questions and trying to get them to think a little bit more critically about the pros and cons of that choice. And by the end of the discussion, they really did see that the better course of action would have been to shield her from that pain. But they didn't see it intuitively. They're not mean, they're just learning. The second myth is that they don't want to talk and that they want adults to back off. So this one is particularly vexing to parents. I have a friend who said, I had this child who I knew and who would tell me every good thing, every bad thing ad nauseum, to the point where I would almost ask him to stop talking so I could do something else. And then suddenly he entered the grunting phase. I would say, how was school? And he'd go, ugh. And that was all she could get. And so at the same time, he was struggling in a lot of different ways and needed her help. And she was really trying to figure out how to connect with him. And she was a therapist. I mean, she knew that she shouldn't be too intrusive. She knew she shouldn't be to pry too much. She knew she should be poker-faced and not overreactive. She had all of these skills that she was bringing to the table that worked really well with her clients, but they weren't working well with her child. And one day she asked him, instead of asking him, what did you learn today? She said, what did your teacher teach you? And suddenly he started talking. And she said, whoa, you're talking. What did I do differently? And she had just rephrased that question to give it a little more emotional distance. And he was able to open up, and he did want to talk. So when we're interacting with tweens, we have to do it on their terms. We might want to talk right after school when we pick them up, but they have been navigating all of those intense highs and lows, and they may need to just retreat into their closet in a dark room, much as adults need to do sometimes at the end of a long work day. And then when they're ready to talk, we might need to set aside whatever we're doing and be available to them at that moment. The same is true for school. They don't necessarily signal that they want support from the adults in the school world, but they very much do. The last myth that I want to mention today is that they're trying to push your buttons. It can really seem like they're trying to push your buttons, especially if they're lying or talking back. One story that happened this school fairly recently is that a teacher was upset with a student. He, in the middle of class, started yelling out random words, vacuum cleaner, soap, just, to get a rise out of his classmates and to make them laugh. And it was disrespectful to her, and she took it personally, and she would ask him to stop, and he wouldn't. She ended up sending him out of the room to take a break at some point, and he didn't stop, in part because of it really had more to do with him than with her. So when I checked in with him later, I said, your teacher was pretty upset with your choice to call out during class. I'm kind of curious why you chose random words. I would love to hear why you chose the words. And he said, because I'm an idiot and I hate myself. And this was a child who was struggling in school. And it was easier to be silly than to admit that he needed some academic support or that he wasn't feeling very good about himself. So we need to see the child through that lens. So in the last 5 minutes, I want to go through some of the skills. In my book, I talk about the top 10 skills that kids need in middle school and beyond. And I'm going to call out a few in particular. First is to consider others' perspectives. So if you can teach a middle schooler to embrace differences in others and to really understand that everyone has a different perspective at a time when they're most insecure, when they are most likely to feel terrible about themselves and not be accepting of their own idiosyncrasies, you're going to create a child who not only is a good person with good character, you're going to create a kid who has a healthy and positive self-identity. They have really weak ability to accurately interpret feedback at this age. So I had, as an example, a child who was sure her teacher hated her and that the teacher didn't call on her, that the teacher didn't grade her fairly. So I said to her, I will come in and I will watch your class and I won't tell her why I'm there and I'll let you know what I see and then we can problem solve from there. And I went in several times and each time I could not pick up on any thread of favoritism or of disliking this child. So I called her back in and I said, what am I missing? I'm not seeing it, but I'm not discounting what you're saying, but I'm just not seeing it. Help me understand. And it turned out that very early in the school year, she had asked for an extra point on a quiz, and the teacher had been annoyed. It felt like grade grubbing to her, and it showed on her face. The teacher then promptly forgot about it, had no ill will toward this child. The child couldn't let it go. And so for the following several weeks was really just holding on to that micro moment. The solution was to bolster their relationship and give them a chance to have a few lunches together and talk it through. But we need to be helping them accurately interpret feedback and pull those thoughts back to the middle, which leads me to self-regulate emotions. And that is tied in with number 9, which is make responsible, healthy, and ethical choices. So kids in middle school, they really don't understand that feelings are not who they are. There can be a lot of shame around certain emotions, like jealousy or anger, and they don't necessarily know that they're not going to last forever, that they're not going to last at the same intensity. They have no life experience. They have no perspective. They have no way of knowing that it will get better. And so we need to be very proactively teaching them coping strategies. So I'll end with a story about making responsible, healthy, and ethical choices. This was a principal actually sent me a note. He had seen something that I had shared on social media about how when a child makes a mistake, instead of shaming them or berating them, to say, were you your best self? And I had posted that because of an experience I had had in my own school. And this principal, Tom Adams, who is at Newfane Middle School in New York, wrote me a message a day or two later to say, you don't know me, but I want to share a story. And he was in the cafeteria when a couple of 8th grade girls came running up to him and said, Mr. Adams, you have to come quickly. So-and-so is crying. And he said, why is she crying? And she said, well, earlier today, this boy told her that this other boy was going to ask her out. And even though this other boy was, in her opinion, in a different social group and unlikely to ask her out, she was a little excited. She liked this boy. She liked the idea of him asking her out. And so at lunch, when she was in the lunch line and when he asked her out, she took it at face value, even though ordinarily she might not have, because she had been primed to expect it. So he asked her out, she said yes, and she started walking back to her table. And by the time she got back to her table, she could hear the boys laughing. And they were laughing really loudly, and as soon as she realized it had been a setup, she started to cry and get really upset. And that was when the girls went and got the principal. The principal saw red. He just couldn't think of anything more cruel for kids to do to one of their classmates. So he hauled them into his office and he started giving them a hard time, and in his head he was thinking, who raised you and how could you behave like this? How could you think this was okay? And they were just stoic and wouldn't let down their defenses and wouldn't engage. And he opened his computer to take some notes, and he happened to see the post I had made about the best self from a prior night. And he stopped and he took a breath and he said, I'm going to start over. Do you think you were your best self? And they started to cry. And they said, no, I don't. And he was able at that point to work with them to find a way forward and to bring their parents in and to do whatever they could to make it right with this girl that they had wronged. And I love that story because it captures the messiness of the age, it captures their inherent desire to be good, kind people, their lack of ability to really interpret how others are feeling, but how quickly they respond to coaching. So I hope all of us, and I know that between everyone in this room and everyone online, we have practitioners, we have educators, we have researchers, psychologists, we have so many people working to help meet the needs of kids in this age group. And I want to encourage everybody to continue to work together and continue to just unconditionally love these middle schoolers and offer them unwavering support, because that's what they really want the most from all of us. Thank you.
So join me again in thanking Phyllis. That was really illuminating and gave me a lot of food for thought about how I respond when it's button pushing time, or not really so. A lot to think about. So again, we're going to hold Q&A until after Joanna and Joaquin speak, and I'm going to introduce both of them now. The panel this morning is really designed to give us a 360 view of what that young adolescent looks like, what that time period looks like, and to help us think about the developmental needs, issues, and considerations to the social environments and programs and policies needed and implemented that have impact on kids of this age. And I think you're also hearing how it has impact on the teachers, on the administrators, and on family members, and how we can support the people who are supporting middle schoolers to be their best selves. So our first speaker is Joanna Williams. She's Associate Professor in the Curry School of Education and Human Development at the University of Virginia and a faculty affiliate of Youth Next, the University of Virginia's Center to Promote Effective Youth Development, and with the Center for Race and Public Education in the South. And the second speaker is Joaquin Tamayo, and he is with the Education Council. Joaquin is a former high school teacher, principal, and federal policymaker. He served with the Obama administration as Director of Strategic Initiatives for Elementary and Secondary Education at the U.S. Department of Education, and was the co-founder and national director of the Middle School Kindness Challenge. So please join me in welcoming Joanna. I don't know, Joanna, if you want to stay there or come up here.